At the calling and shouting out, Teodoro looks up from his notebook and his maps. Some of the crew have gathered at the port side, shielding their eyes from the sunlight.
"They left only an hour ago,"
says one of the crew. "Maybe they found fresh water. Or oranges.
"Or the whole place is infested with tigers."
Not this far north," says Teodoro. He abandons his maps to join the crew at the rail. The maps are useless now anyway, since the storm blew them so off course that they're under the illustrated compass rose and the seal of the Cartographers Guild. The sea breeze stirs Teodoro's dark hair curling around his temples, combs through his short beard as he squints brown eyes against the midday sun. That's the longboat, all right, but something is wrong. Its painted white siding looks discolored, darker, perhaps, and the crew within the longboat appears to be unconscious. They look strange, as though... "What's wrong with them?" asks one of the crew. They fall asleep at the oars? "Why is it coming right at us if there's no rowers?" Unease twists through Teodoro like a wrung handkerchief. The island had looked so friendly once the skies cleared, forested and lush even from a mile offshore. He'd been buzzing with the excitement of reporting back to the guild once they returned home to Andovia. A new island. A new place to map and explore and understand. The first true find of any significance in nearly 100 years. Now, he's not so sure. Then the longboat bumps against the hull of the ship, and Teodoro nearly jerks back. One of the crew vomits over the railing. The longboat has been stripped of half its fittings for the sail and missing the sail itself. Half the oars are gone. Every other slat has been removed from its siding with mathematical precision. Each of the crew within has been sliced cleanly in half from skull to groin. But wherever their other halves are, it isn't in the boat. They're draped grotesquely across the rowing benches, a clear view of exactly half their organs. Some have only their left sides, others their right. Not a drop of blood has been spilled inside the longboat. They're clearly, monstrously dead. But even in the paler ones, no faces show the gray pallor of death. With their gently closed eye, they could be sleeping. Teodoro's own stomach rolls. Almost worse than the bodies is the boat itself. The slats are a centimeter tall and longer than a barge pole. To remove one and leave the other and do it again, the whole way through, without a trace of binding sap left behind. The captain looks to Teodoro for an explanation. Though captains command the crew, it's a cartographer who guides every voyage. But Teodoro can no more summon an explanation than his murdered crew's other halves. "We must return home," he says, clutching his notebook. He must write exactly what he's seen, unflinchingly. Sketch it if he must. Record-keeping is a cartographer's job, just as much as tracing new coastlines. The guild will know what to do. Five years pass, and Teodoro is working on refining a new detailed print of the coast of Rockward, when Filippo strides through his office door at the Cartographers Guild. Filippo looks well. His stylishly wild dark hair seems made for Teodoro's fingers to caress, and his bronze skin is even darker from weeks at sea. He's wearing a new doublet, an emerald green that brings out the same in his eyes. Tempting as he looks, it's not quite enough to forgive him. "Where have you been?" Teodoro asks, rising to meet him. He takes Filippo by the arm and draws him out of the office, through the main drafting hall and past two meeting alcoves. The place is empty this late in the day. "You were due back in port last week."
A storm blew us off course.
Filippo lets himself be drawn along, beaming.
I take it you missed me.
Are you sure you didn't lose yourself in more of your equations?
For once, no. I left my theorems at home. Teo, I've got news.
Is it good or bad?
It's good.
Then it can wait. At last, they reach the back garden, its pitted flagstones and towering hedges and ivy-draped brick. Fireflies drift through blue twilight and cricket song. I need you too much.
My, if I had known. Oop! Hello.
Teodoro takes Filippo's fine green doublet by the lapels and shoves him into the ivy, and before Filippo can finish a laugh, Teodoro is kissing him. Their kisses never taste so fine as when one of them is gone for weeks. Teodoro's fingers find their home in Filippo's soft hair, and Filippo knots his own hands in Teodoro's plain but elegant white shirt, pulling him close.
That's better, isn't it?
You said 5 weeks, Teodoro accuses between kisses.
And I've taken 6, I know.
Filippo smiles.
You'll have to blame the heavens.
Teodoro just might. It was a simple expedition, an attempt to explore the lagoons of Esterplain for the source of its fresh water. Filippo should have been home on time. Since Teodoro lost his taste for the high seas, Filippo's been taking other cartographers. It was Luca this time. Luca, that simpering suck-up, all the blustering of a veteran and none of the humility of a rookie, which he is. I've missed you, Teodoro says.
And I've missed you too. Luca is even worse at sea than he is on land.
Filippo's eyes are feverish bright.
Teo, my news.
Yes, fine. What is it?
We've found somewhere new.
Teodoro blinks at his lover. You can't have. Not on the route you sailed.
It wasn't on the route we sailed. Remember, we blew off course in the storm and...
Filippo actually laughs in delight.
North, in fact. Lucas said we were actually beneath the compass rose on the map.
All at once, Teodoro's stomach feels as hollowed out as the spaces between the wooden slats of a longboat. Beneath the compass rose, he repeats.
On the map.
Filippo says, as if Teodoro hasn't drawn that damn compass and key every day since the start of his apprenticeship 20 years ago.
I always assumed there was nothing there, else I'd cover it with an emblem, but there is something there. An island, looks like. Forested, too. The lumber trade might even... Teo?
Teodoro's pulse beats in double time. Did you send anyone? Crew to explore the place?
No, everyone was too shaken from the storm, and we were running behind schedule as it is. Teo, what's the matter with you?
No one, Teodoro says at last, is supposed to know about that island. Filippo's face twists into confusion.
But you do.
We do. The Cartographers Guild. Teodoro wraps his hands around his elbows. The cozy garden feels cooler than it had just a moment ago. Even the flashes from the fireflies are no longer charming. They're a warning, like blinking lights at the top of a tower. Stay back from the rocks. Trust me, Filippo. Please, forget that place.
How can I forget it? I've already gone to the Queen for funding. She was my first stop.
You what? Teodoro whirls on him. What did she say?
She approved it. The lumber is as good as sold, and since the place is forested, that could mean quarries, quartz, and marble. Teo, please. Luca
wouldn't know. Teodoro is reeling. He hasn't been with us long enough. You have to send someone else.
You're scaring me.
Filippo takes Teodoro's sleeve and gently tugs him around, trying to meet his eyes.
Tell me what's going on.
I can't. We aren't permitted. There's no...
So you're telling me...
Filippo presses.
That the entire Cartographers Guild is aware that this island exists, and they've hidden it behind the goddamn compass rose?
Ask yourself why. Teodoro tries to calm himself. What would we get out of such a thing?
I don't know. Your own personal paradise? They've got gemstones in the earth, and you've got the paper to buy it?
Teodoro seizes Filippo by the arms. We are protecting people. No one has ever gone there and come back alive.
Please, Teo, honey, there's no way that's true.
Teodoro looks past Filippo, back into the guild. With everyone else gone for the day, the archives will be vacant. If he can't convince Filippo, then maybe the truth will. Let me show you.
24th of Orthus, 900-6. Encountered a forested island at 50 degrees north, 10 east. Sent a contingency of 5 fellows to search for fresh water. Lost sight of the dinghy once it was ashore. Sent another in the morning. That too disappeared. The third boat was prepared, but then the first returned. By God, I have never seen the likes of what was inside. A single man, but large as 5, laid on his back across the benches, with limbs dangling over the gunwale. He was quite dead. Mr. Pike pointed out that the giant had the same bell and hyacinth tattoo as Mr. Mosley, one of the fellows sent with the original search party. Upon closer inspection, it appeared the dead giant also had Mr. Sanderson's unmistakable broken nose, a mangled scar over his left elbow, like Mr. Bauer, Mr. Kane's freckled complexion, and the false teeth of Mr. Ewing. It was as though the 5 of them had been merged into a single being. The body was so cold to the touch that Mr. Pike's fingertips were immediately afflicted with frostburn. But there was no off-gassing of cool mist, despite the warm temperature. We committed the body to the sea and are returning home at once.
16th, Erisonth 963. An incomprehensible horror befell us today on our journey to the Arctic Halo. We discovered an island not yet on any of our maps and sent a landing party to forage for fresh provisions. A meager time later, the longboat returned. Instead of the 7 burly young lads we sent, we found 7 elderly men, so wizened that their paper-thin flesh drooped and their backs curled. And yet they were our crew. Mr. Jordan still bore the scars of his youth. Mr. Jovovich still bore the tattoos of his old trade. In voices as brittle as rust, they demanded to know why we'd sailed away from them so long ago, forced them to survive on the island alone. But not one of them could recall what they'd actually seen or done on the island. Within an hour of coming back aboard, they were dead, to the last man.
9th of Plenson, 10:06. Avoid island at 50 north, 10 east at all costs. Need remove any possibility of anyone coming in this direction again. God save our souls.
5th of Jorinth, 1015. I should have listened to the guild. From the splatter, you'd think they fell from a great height, but there was no fall, no plummet, just blood and skin, and bone and fat, yellow and red, and red and red. I should have listened to the guild. Should have listened to the guild. Should have
The
listened
last
to the
line
guild.
repeats all the way
Should have
down the
listened
page,
to
the penmanship increasingly frantic until it trails right off the paper. It's the last in the stack, dated 50 years ago, until Teodoro's notes. Filippo reads them all in the steady lamplight. He even reads Teodoro's account, the horrifying bloodless half-bodies returned in that boat with its inexplicably missing slats. Teodoro watches his lover's eyes flit along every line, every horror imaginable, until at last, Filippo lowers the stack and looks up with new fire in his gaze, and Teodoro knows all at once that Filippo is lost.
Well,
Filippo says brightly,
we have to go now.
"How does this not dissuade you?"
Because it all sounds completely imaginary. Perhaps there's simply some kind of sea vapor that causes hallucinations, or they didn't see forward.
Then explain what happened to the crew. Filippo quirks a brow.
So these crews really did die? Surely families must have been affected, their partners and parents taken in their prime? Why haven't I heard of it?
Because we paid them good coin not to talk.
Ah, right, of course. Fine. Look, whatever you did, something's going on with that island that no one understands. I don't know what it is, but I want to find out.
Teodoro pulls the journal pages out of Filippo's hands and then takes those hands, gripping tightly. His own palms are clammy. This isn't one of your mathematical theorems you can solve in your spare time. This is dangerous. Why can't you just leave it alone?
Because there's some kind of magic at work, isn't there? Some kind of something at work? If we can understand what it is, maybe harness it, use it, and yes, describe it, perhaps with mathematics. I mean, if we could be the first.
People have been trying for centuries, and look what they got in return.
Well, it's no wonder. Approaching it from the water is clearly the wrong move. Let's take a lighter-than-air balloon and survey it from the skies.
Teodoro wants to weep. How do we know it will be any different?
We don't! But since when are you so cautious?
Filippo is incredulous.
I'm a captain. You're a cartographer. We were made for the unknown.
He touches Teodoro's cheek.
Think of it. If we conquer the island, we'll be remembered into the next age.
Teodoro leans into the touch. Is being remembered that important to you?
Of course it is.
Filippo grins, boyish in his enthusiasm.
Think of the portraits they'll paint.
He looks like the day they met, young and green, hungry for the sea. Teodoro turns his head to press a kiss against Filippo's palm. Then I'll go with you. 50 north, 10 east, and there it is. A far-off coast of verdant green, rocky hills rising beyond the tree line. Teodoro has never been seasick in his life, but today, his stomach churns. Filippo is squinting into his telescope, a shining length of burnished bronze that Teodoro gifted him during their third summer together. It's one of Filippo's most prized possessions, next to the calculus books from his youth.
Can't see anything that looks like anything.
Says Filippo.
You sure this is the right place?
This is the one. Every hair on Teodoro's neck stands on end, and a fine tremor has started in his hands. Don't you recognize it?
Sure, I just don't see anything to be nervous about.
Filippo claps him on the shoulder as he moves past.
Hey, make ready the balloon!
They've got 20 minutes, maybe a little more. There isn't much time, but Teodoro can do it. He can do this. He will do this. Filippo, he says, have tea with me before you go.
What? Everyone's making ready.
Yes, everyone else is handling it. Teodoro tries to smile. You know what I fear. You can humor me for a moment, can't you? Filippo smiles, indulging.
Of course.
They go to the lush captain's quarters, Filippo's quarters, where a kettle is waiting exactly as Teodoro arranged. We can toast to a successful expedition, Teodoro says with forced cheer, but his hand shakes even worse as he pours cups for them both.
Tail.
Filippo joins him, a steadying hand over top his lover's.
I'll be fine. And even if I'm not, you know the thrill of discovery as well as I do. It's more than worth it. There's nothing like it.
Nothing except long, quiet evenings in Filippo's arms. Teodoro hands over one of the teacups. I know, he says, watching as Filippo takes a smiling sip. You'll be fine. It takes a moment, but Teodoro knows it's working. when Filippo says, Teodoro gulps. Are you all right? Filippo's eyes are a little unfocused.
Just, dizzy.
He presses a palm to his forehead.
Yeah, perhaps my sea legs aren't really... Oh my god,
He steps around Teodoro and drops heavily onto the rich silks of his bedspread.
I feel awful.
Teodoro kneels before him. Bear it another moment. You'll be unconscious soon. Only for an hour or so. Shock fights its way through Filippo's bleary eyes.
What? Teo,
You're not going to that damned island. Teodoro takes Filippo's face in his hands and kisses his forehead. I'm going instead. I love you.
Teo, no, don't go.
But Filippo's eyes are already drifting shut.
Teo, I'm going. Let me go.
Teodoro pulls up Filippo's legs to lay him across the bed, then lingers over a final kiss to Filippo's forehead. At last, he turns for the deck, his notebook under his arm. He's ready. The basket of the lighter-than-air balloon sits high astern, a pace back from the helm, where the furled sails can't interfere with the width of the balloon itself. Where's the captain? Asks one of the crew. Unwell, Teodoro says shortly. He's asked me to go in his stead. Teodoro nearly insists on going alone, but the crew won't be persuaded, and 3 can fit in the basket. They all wish to be remembered too, to say they were some of the first to clap eyes on new territory. All aboard, and the wicker door looped shut. Teodoro turns the crank on the lamp, secured just under the canvas opening. As the flame rises higher, so does the balloon, the ship falling away beneath them. It's done. There's no going back unless he jumps into the sea, and already they're reaching a height where the impact would kill him on contact. Teodoro watches the ship until the crew are indistinguishable, and finally turns away, toward the forest, the rolling hills. In the distance, the top of the tree line begins to tremble.
Filippo lurches onto the deck and squints against the searing gold of sunset. His marrow has been replaced with lead. His head throbs with dizziness. But he makes it to the crew, huddled around the side of the ship, giving the deck a concerning list to port. Teodoro, he says, braced against the rail. Where the hell is he? He and the others took the balloon up a few hours ago, Captain, says the first mate, right beside him, just like you said. But look! Filippo clings to the rail. There's something pale in the water, oblong, floating right toward the boat. For a moment, Filippo doesn't understand what he's seeing. Then he realizes. It's the canvas of the lighter-than-air balloon, except it seems to have taken the shape of the waves. In fact, when one short crest slaps into another, the water is as pale white as the canvas itself. Filippo counts 2 bodies floating atop the canvas, arms splayed. Neither of them has Teo's pale gold complexion. As the waterlogged balloon drifts closer, one of the crew jumps into the sea to try to grab one of the balloon's ropes. But the rope falls through his hands like the water all around him, particles dispersing. Confused, he swims towards the canvas, but as he reaches for it, his hand passes right through, leaving a dark, sloshing gap where the pale canvas once was. He swims nearer to the bodies, which are close enough to the ship by now that Filippo can pick out the frozen expressions of horror on their faces, a fear so vivid that nausea rises in his throat. But the same thing happens. When the crewman touches the bodies, his hand passes into the water. What appears to be solid skin simply dissolves, leaving a gap between elbow and wrist, or knee and ankle. After a moment, the colors float back together in slow streams. Filippo blinks and blinks, clearer by the moment, as confusion rises around him. He isn't hallucinating, but something of square brown leather is floating atop the canvas, not part of the waves, but distinct from it. Teodoro's notebook. Through his horror, despite 1,000 questions, Filippo manages to yell out to the crewmen in the water. The crewman swims back to the rope ladder with his notebook held above his head. As he comes aboard, the other crew make room for Filippo, just as confused, just as horrified, as Filippo takes the notebook. It's completely dry. It's been floating on the water for God knows how long, and yet the pages are dry. It's almost completely full of Teodoro's notes. His small, neat script, as familiar to Filippo as his own. But after Teo's notes end, Filippo finds a blank page, and then a dozen pages of chaos. Each one is filled to the margins with child's scrawl in what looks like charcoal pressed deeply into the paper. But it's not words, it's equations? He says aloud. Mathematical formulae, complicated even to him. Letters, brackets, division, and multiplication. Violent slashes to divide countless fractions. But to the right of every frenzied equal sign sits only blankness. Filippo flips through, increasingly frantic. Every page is full, symbols he only half recognizes, multipliers that defy human computing power. This isn't Teodoro's work. It couldn't be, even if he'd inexplicably changed his handwriting. And the last page is blank, as if Filippo has been given just that much space to solve the impossible equations. If he solves them, then perhaps he'd be allowed to cross onto the island unharmed. Perhaps he'd even be allowed to find Teodoro and bring him home. "Captain," says the crewman who came back aboard, dripping water all over the deck. "Captain, what do we do?" Filippo is already striding from his quarters, gripping the notebook to his chest. He says, "Give me an hour." After 3, a crewman knocks on his closed door. "Captain, some of us are wondering. I'm almost finished." Reams of paper cover Filippo's desk, the floor. His inkwell is running low. He'll need to pull another from his storage cabinet soon. "Just wait a little longer." He's narrowing in on the answer to the first equation. 2 multiplied by 5.6. So 5.6 is the gravitational potential, and this is the math nearby, but the distance from the observer. He nearly crumples the paper. You should understand this. It's just time dilation, a familiar formula for any mathematics hobbyist. But filling each variable, rather than simply understanding what they represent, is harder than he anticipated. At sundown, he's got it. The answer to the first equation. He shoves his scrap paper aside and scribbles the answer beside its waiting equal sign in Teo's notebook. A strange, low tone rises on the edge of his perception, and then disappears. Shocked yells from outside startle him. Half a breath later, the crew is banging on the door. "Captain!" calls one of them. "Get out here! The mainmast is gone!" Filippo looks up from the page. "Gone?" "Sir, it's gone. It just disappeared. It didn't fall. It just did." "Now we're getting somewhere," Filippo mutters. Louder, he adds, "We can row home if we must." When he solves the next equation, the 4 in the mizzenmast vanish. The next equation, near morning, one of the crew pounds on his door and demands in rising panic whether Mr. Bernardi and Mr. Holbein are in the captain's quarters, because he can't find them anywhere else. "Leave me be," says Filippo, ignoring the door rattling on its hinges. He's certain he didn't lock it, and yet none of the crew enter. He solves the 4th and 5th equation that afternoon, and afterwards, another crew bangs on his door yet again. "Captain, if you don't come out here, the rest of us are taking the longboats and trying our luck." "Godspeed," he says, brushing a clump of hair off the page in front of him. He's been tugging at his dark locks as he works, and it's starting to come out in concerning tufts. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. Because the closer he gets to finishing this damn notebook, the closer he is to getting Teo back. After the 7th answer, as he bends to grab a pile of notes off the floor, his whole frame twinges strangely, and a pressing inspection at his sides reveals that he might be missing ribs. Filippo presses onward. He doesn't hunger, he doesn't thirst, he can't sleep and doesn't try. Days pass. The clamor outside his door slows until it finally stops. The once busy ship, now blessedly silent. It takes a week to find the answer to the last question, and when he does, he shoves scrap paper aside to open Teo's notebook one more time. He lifts his pen, both hands shaking. He's missing every other finger on his left, and he's certain he can see candlelight through his right. It just means it's time to finish the work. The nib scratches into the page, trailing strands of ink in the shape of his answer. With a relieved sigh, Filippo sits back.
Filippo.
Filippo drops his pen in breathless hope and turns towards the door. Teo? He lurches to his feet, stumbles across his quarters, and throws the latch. Teodoro looks like not a moment has passed since Filippo saw him, golden and handsome, those clever brown eyes shining in the early morning light. Beyond him, no, slightly through him, Filippo can see the empty deck, just like the crew reported. But perhaps that's a trick of the light, because Filippo's eyes are filling with tears. Teo. Teo smiles softly and holds out his hand.
A week later, a strange ship drifts into Andovia's main harbor. It coasts past fishing vessels and merchant barges, past the other great sailing ships of Andovia's most famous explorers. This one is missing its masts and sails, its helm, even the paint on the figurehead. Later inspection will show it's rudderless, too. No crew is aboard. The captain's quarters are completely empty of any personal furnishings, no gear in the footlocker, not even bed linens. The only evidence anyone's ever been there at all is a notebook sitting open on the desk, its pages trembling like a tree line stirring in a sea breeze.